This is the Climate Director at the Australia Institute, Richie Merzian. Richie, thanks so much for your time. The government is adamant that it's drawing a red line on the issue of coal, given its importance to our economy, and it's also reiterating to the participants, to the other leaders, that Australia is the biggest contributor when it comes to climate in the region. Both of those things are true, aren't they?
Australia is one of the largest contributors in the region, definitely, and Australia has this fixation with coal, and we saw that the Prime Minister bringing coal into the Parliament, and it could be that his fixation with coal will trump the Pacific survival at this summit. And the Pacific want as strong action as possible, and that includes no new coal mines and no new coal-fired power stations. So if Australia can't actually listen and look at how it could meet the Pacific's concerns, then it will probably leave Tuvalu disappointed.
But as Alex Hawke points out, the Minister there are 20 Australian coal facilities. Worldwide, there are thousands. Worldwide, there are 2,459 coal mines in operation. What do you say to that in terms of our place in the broader market?
Well, Australia is the largest coal exporter in the world. So that's unquestioned. That's what our own government sort of often talks to when it also talks about how big coal is in terms of its place in the economy. So Australia has a major role to play here. And also Australia wants to be part of the Pacific family. So it has to find a way to marry those two things together. And that really comes down to, what is the transition plan? Does Australia need to open up new coal mines? Does it need to go to new coal-fired power stations? Is there a way of working with the transition with the Pacific Islands and with our interests here?
When you raise the point that we're one of the biggest coal exporters in the world, that's not actually what the Pacific Island leaders are asking for, though, is it? And if we pull back on that for the sake of appeasing them on climate change, we wouldn't have any money to get them in any kind of funding. We give them billions of dollars.
Well, actually, coal doesn't actually play as big a role in our economy in terms of revenue as we think. There's a lot of fossil fuel subsidies that sit underneath exports, and so Australia could transition. And also, they're not asking for us to close down our current mines. They're asking us to not open up new mines, and that's a different proposition altogether. Australian Institute research shows that opening up new mines could actually be detrimental to existing mines and existing coal mine workers. So there's ways that we can do both. I think the issue here is that Australia is not trying to listen to the Pacific, it's not trying to transition, and without a climate and energy policy, then Australia is just going in blind with its fixation for coal.
Wouldn't you say, though, that there were some positive developments this week in terms of the money that's been committed to this issue? We spoke of the $500 million for the Pacific. There's also $140 million for the private sector mobilisation fund, which is Pacific and Southeast Asia. So the government, despite the criticism of it in terms of climate, they're actually they are taking steps in this regard, and are adamant they're going to meet their Paris target.
Well, if those are steps, then they're extremely small baby steps, and what the Pacific helped them survive. That $500 million is a real tokenistic effort. It's not new money. It's coming at the expense of other things, and also it really just keeps up the status quo of how much Australia usually provides to the Pacific on these issues. So there's nothing new that Australia is bringing to the table, and what the Pacific's looking for is a serious commitment, serious climate action. And let's also remember that Australia is using these controversial carbon credits, which pretty much cut its emission reduction efforts in half, and that's something the Pacific have also asked Australia to cancel.
But that other private sector mobilisation fund, that is a renewal of that money, so that is another commitment dealing with this issue.
It is a new commitment, but as you mentioned, it's for Southeast Asia as much as for the Pacific. And if that is about working with the private sector, then oftentimes the private sector are working not in the Pacific, which is why Australia and others have to provide aid money. So most of that money will probably flow to Southeast Asia rather than the Pacific, and it doesn't really provide them with much, especially when they're faced with such huge impacts from...
It's a tokenistic offer, this $500 million. What for you wouldn't be a tokenistic offer, and how much would that cost? Is it just an open-ended assumption that we have to put infinite amount of money into it?
No, it doesn't have to be infinite. It just needs to be something like what Australia used to put towards climate change, and that includes contributing to the Green Climate Fund. So last year, the Prime Minister pulled out of the Green Climate Fund arbitrarily via an interview on 2GB, and that came as a surprise to the Department of Foreign Affairs, according to what came out through Senate estimates. So really, that Green Climate Fund played a major role. It gave more money to the Pacific than Australia did. And Australia played a huge role in getting that GCF, the Green Climate Fund, to direct its efforts to the Pacific. So one thing that could demonstrate Australia's credibility would be rejoining the Green Climate Fund and putting more money in. It doesn't even have to be a huge amount. They put $200 million in over 5 years. Another $200 million would go a fair bit.
when you talk about the Kyoto carryover, the comparison between our economic profile, our resources, for example, and Britain, which cancelled the Kyoto carryover, I mean, they can't really be compared, though, can they, in terms of the industrial base here versus Britain or other nations that have cancelled the Kyoto carryover?
I mean, the UK is much further along in terms of shifting away from coal, you know, the birthplace, but now it's much further along. But Germany was as coal-reliant as Australia was in terms of its power, and it has now agreed that it will shut down its coal-fired power stations in the next 15-odd years. And so Australia could do the same thing. There are other examples of how to transition. I mean, these Kyoto carryover credits completely undermine the Pacific's interest in raising ambition. Our research shows that it's about 8 times the fossil fuel emissions of everyone in the Pacific, including New Zealand. So it's a huge thing for Australia to try and game the system by using these credits to water down its efforts, and it just goes to the lack of credibility about what Australia is doing on climate action.
Does that take into account the population difference, though? Because by population, you could almost combine the Pacific and New Zealand. And
Sure, you totally could. But in terms of Australia's emissions per capita, if you want to do it on that way, then Australia is still one of the highest in terms of emissions.
Richie Merzian, Climate Director at the Australia Institute. Thanks, as always. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Now, for nearly 7 months, speculation about the cause of the death of footballer